Morning, guys. We're on Hebrews chapter 4, reading from verse 4 to verse 7. And this whole chapter really looks on the resting and the aspects of the Sabbath rest and how Christ has fulfilled that commandment of resting. But here in verse 4 it says, "For he has said somewhere concerning the seventh day, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works." And so in Genesis 2, the writer's quoting Genesis 2 verse 2 to 3, and it says in Genesis 2, "And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done." So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. And so God created all the world in 6 days, and then on the seventh day, which is a Saturday, he rested from all his created order. And so there's an aspect that God reminds us that we need to be entering a rest as he entered into that rest. And that rest, there's a progression of the Sabbath rest, starting from Genesis. Then the commandment is brought in Exodus 20. The commandment is repeated in Deuteronomy 5. And we see this through even the different prophets, and each time it talks about a sign. And so it's not a moral law, it's a sign law, because it says this is a sign and it's a pointing somewhere. And it ends up in the New Testament, as we see, fulfilled in Christ, pointing to Christ, who becomes the Sabbath rest. And we no longer labor of trying to get our way into the promised land, or in the context of the New Testament, trying to work out our own salvation on our own. We now rest in the work of the cross. And so when Jesus went to the cross, he is risen again, he's seated at the right hand of God the Father, and he has rested from that work of saving people. And so it ultimately, the Sabbath fulfills itself in the cross. But let's just carry on in verse 5, and it says, "And again in this passage, they shall not enter my rest." And he quotes Psalm 95. And so even David, who is a king in the promised land, and he has entered the promised land, and so we know that is a part fulfillment of the Sabbath command, because we read that in Deuteronomy. So God shifts the focus from resting on creation to entering the promised land. So let's look at that in Deuteronomy 5 verse 12. In 5 he repeats all the different commandments, and we get to the Sabbath, which is the fourth commandment, and he says in verse 12, "Observe the Sabbath to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day it is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work." And he repeats, "Your son, your male servant, ox, donkey," exactly like in Exodus 20. And in verse 15 it says, "You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt." You were in bondage, and we were all in bondage in the sense that we were all slaves to sin. "And the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." And so now we see the focus on being delivered from bondage of Egypt, and us being delivered from bondage of sin, and now entering Christ, who is the Sabbath rest. And this obviously back then would have been entering the promised land, which is a land of flowing with milk and honey, a beautiful land which symbolizes ultimately heaven in the end. But verse 15, "You shall remember that you were a slave in the land, and the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." So the reason given here in Deuteronomy 5 is now the focus on being delivered from that bondage and then entering that promised land. And then David in the Psalms, after being a king and writing the Psalms, he's now saying, guys, you need to enter into his rest, and don't harden your hearts. Today is the day of salvation. Come to Christ. Here's the Sabbath rest. and you need to enter into resting from trying to earn your way to heaven, to coming to Him in faith and putting your trust in Him, and in that way you enter that rest. In verse 6 it says, "Therefore, since it remains for some to enter, and those who formerly had good news preached to them failed to enter because of disobedience or unbelief," in the King James. And so even today He repeats, don't harden your hearts. Today is the day of salvation. Enter that rest through Jesus, who is become the Lord of the Sabbath, who is the Lord isn't curious. He is the King. He is the one in whom we enter that rest. Amen.